Hi, my name is Sarah DeJulia, and I will be presenting my research project on deviant behavior and suicide. The question that I chose was, how is the deviant label applied to those who have committed suicide? I chose this question because it is relevant to me and my past and what I have dealt with. And I believe that if we learn more about suicide and and how it is related to deviance in life, we will accomplish more than just learning about deviance, but also about suicide and suicide prevention. As a deviant, pretty much what it is having a norms or expecting the normal. When you go against the norm, that is deviant. And suicide in this case is considered to be deviant, and this is why I chose the question. To understand more from my perspective and also for others out there, for why suicide will be considered deviant to those who have committed suicide and to those who also have attempted suicide. I will be discussing the effects, the importance, and also eventually the outcome and what I decided suicide would be deviant as. What is the importance? What about the effects after suicide? After suicide, you are left with not only funeral costs, but also family and friends and school, and you're leaving many things behind. Some of the effects after suicide can affect loved ones traumatically. It's a death in the family on top of having to understand where they went wrong and themselves thinking they could have prevented it. In a sense, some of the effects could be someone going through depression or a loved one having a very traumatic time to deal with it. And this is why it's considered deviant, because this was something that was taken away not by natural causes of death, but by pure choice. Another question was, is it selfish? I led to this question because of how when I was doing research, there was many people that were saying that it is selfish in comments that I read on stories, on polls that I took with friends. Most of them came up with it being selfish to commit suicide, because not only are you leaving your loved ones, but you are also taking away from this world someone who could have made a difference. In that sense, some people consider it to be deviant because you have a life. You aren't sick. You are not, in a sense, you have a good, stable life, but you still continue to choose to kill yourself over somebody who has cancer and has no choice. For example, someone who is sick and on their deathbed and who is begging, just for another day to stay with their family or to just have one more night to be with their loved ones or spend Christmas together, versus somebody who is not so much dying, but in a sense thinks about killing themselves and then does commit suicide. In this case, some people see this as being selfish, which leads to deviance. Who does it affect? In this case, suicide, when you commit suicide, not only are you affecting family, but also friends and coworkers, bills that people will eventually have to pay back if you're put in debt. It affects a lot of people, and in this case, that is why it is considered deviant and to most aspects. In certain cases, it could also affect maybe nobody who feels like they have nobody there, they would seem as though they aren't affecting anybody. And that is also where does committing suicide act as a deviant behavior or somebody who is just going through a mental illness. The normality. I chose this or for the normality in cases of why it is deviant, because it is going against the norm. For suicide, it it compare and contrast to both. Normal is someone who dies by natural causes or who doesn't choose to die, but it happens. When you are going against the norm, you are taking your own life in a sense that you have a choice, but you choose to not live by your own choice rather than life, or in my case, God choosing to take you out of a life at a certain time or to come home. The normal to this is somebody who just dies on their deathbed rather than somebody who decides to commit suicide. The stats that I decided to look up stats on suicide rates and suicide through gender, age, and how they affect and why they would be considered deviant. The highest suicide was between ages 25 through 44, and out of those, most girls attempted suicide. However, more boys were more successful. So although girls had a higher rate at attempting suicide, boys who had a lower rate had more of a successful committing suicide. Among all the people who committed suicide, firearms were most common among female. These are the graphs shown. The red is for female and the blue is for male. As you can see, in 2002 through 2011, it definitely is not a straight line, and it's up and down all over the place. This goes by gender. So as you can see, this is attempted suicide by female, and the attempted suicide by male. The suicide mortality rate. This is those who actually committed suicide and were successful by gender. As you can see here, the blue is for male, and the semi-purple and pink is for female. In this graph, it shows that the males were definitely more successful in committing suicide rather than the females. A way that people will commit suicide is through firearms or through other methods such as hanging or overdosing on pills. In this case, by gender, firearms were the most common among female, and male, the most common was other, which could be any sort of medication, overdose, or hanging, or any methods where you would kill yourself. Some research that I did were some stories, and one that I chose out of the many stories I looked up was about this girl recently named Rebecca. She was, in quotations, quote, quote, bullied to death. In this story, Rebecca went to school and she had problems over boys. She was in high school. There was girls on the internet telling her to commit suicide and you should die. And eventually she went and she jumped off a roof and she killed herself. In this sense, these are all the comments, or I was going through the comments, and one of them, quote, said, "Seriously, what this girl did was idiotic. Though I guess this isn't a surprise, considering the lack of self-esteem, communication skills, and a good sense of logic that her parents should have instilled in her. I have to say that I honestly don't feel much sympathy for this girl. I generally reserve sympathy for those whose wounds are not self-inflicted. I didn't get the name, but I did get where they were, their username, and that was in the Blaze 13 September. This is somebody who considers it to be deviant, and it was good to see from this perspective for me to understand. The consequences are people who are affected by suicide. For family members, they can be depressed. Some can actually follow in the footsteps of those who have committed suicide, and some would question themselves as to why they don't understand and feel as though it was something that they had a problem with. Um, one of, as I was researching, I looked up a theorist and theories, and Emil Durkheim was one of them. And in a paper that somebody would write about him, he said, deviance was not alien to society, but a byproduct of the way society was organized and functioned. So in this case, he pretty much summed up is deviant is not so much as a rule, but as what society created it to be, what is not the majority. Another quote is, consistent with the traditional functional approach to the study of deviance, suicide is behavior contrary to the norms and therefore deviant. Not all types of suicide were deviant acts. Altruistic suicides were sometimes required by norms and therefore act of conformity, not deviance. For this, he is pretty much saying for mental illness, it shouldn't be considered deviant. People who actually assist people in suicide can be punished in our days and age. And committing suicide is illegal. However, if one succeeds, obviously they cannot be punished. Those who commit suicide are seen as a disgrace. From comments that I've read on the Blaze website, and also from people that I would have conversations with about those who have committed suicide. What are some triggers? Divorce, bullying, depression, mental illness, etc. Many things can trigger somebody who wants to commit suicide or feels as though they have no reason to live. Conclusion. My conclusion from all the research that I did was considering it to not be deviant. Although I could see how it can be deviant, I hope through my research you too could also see how it could be deviant, but also non-deviant. As a society, we are all about norms, and someone who chooses to take their life is considered deviant because of the fact that we are to cherish our life, and most people are scared of dying. That is a majority. And for those who think that committing suicide is selfish and also a disgrace, that could be another reason why it is considered deviant. Here is a bully suicide project. There's many people who are also willing to help rather than considering it to be deviant. From mental illnesses to many other things that cause suicide, it is not something that I would consider deviant, or from the research I've done personally. However, to society, it is considered deviant because people want to live rather than trying to take their own life. These are my references. I used the book, I used a couple websites, and also a report that I wasn't able to get much information from where it came from, but I did what I can. So thank you for listening, and that is the end of my slideshow. I hope you understood more of deviance and how it can be related to suicide and the social aspect of it, and how it is viewed from both sides. Thank you.